My name is Dr. Alejandro Ruiz, and for nearly 2 decades I served with Argentina's National Park Service. Over the course of 17 years, I was stationed in many remote corners of this vast country. But the place that claimed most of my attention, and a large piece of my soul, was the Gran Chaco. Some foreigners call it the Chaco Plains, though that name hardly does justice to its immensity or its contradictions. The Chaco is a land of extremes, a patchwork of thorny scrub, endless savannas, scattered wetlands, palm groves that shimmer under the sun, and shadowy stretches of subtropical forest where the air hangs thick and still. It stretches across borders, spilling into Paraguay and Bolivia, and in its depths live thousands of creatures and plants found nowhere else on Earth. It is at once beautiful and unforgiving. Yet, for all its grandeur, the Chaco has long been under siege. Since the 1970s, illegal loggers have hacked their way through the forests, leaving scars of stumps and ash. Cattle ranchers set fires to clear the land, the smoke rising in vast black columns until the sky itself seemed to mourn. During my final years of service, I watched tens of thousands of hectares vanish in smoke and flame. I have witnessed destruction born of greed, and it left me hollow. But as tragic as that was, there were darker things in the Chaco, events no fire or chainsaw could explain. In all my years among those trees and plains, there was one discovery that marked me forever. It is not the memory of the animals or the rivers that stays with me, but rather what I stumbled upon in the late summer of 1992. It began north of a small town named Puerto Libertad, about 30 kilometers from the Paraguayan border. I had gone out alone that week to inspect a section of forest that was rumored to have been targeted by loggers. My ATV carried me over barren stretches of thorn scrub until I reached a stand of tall quebracho and lapacho trees, their trunks rising like solemn guardians. For about an hour, I moved carefully under the canopy, taking notes, marking trees on my map, and scanning for signs of chainsaw cuts. The forest appeared intact, alive with the sound of birds, the air heavy with the perfume of blossoms. Relieved, I turned back toward where I had left my vehicle. Walking in the Chaco is never easy. Trails are rare, and the undergrowth hides roots, rocks, and the occasional snake. Many times I had stumbled, but this time was different. I stepped over a thick branch lying in the grass, only to catch my boot on something else immediately after. My balance gave way. I pitched forward and fell heavily, the impact sounding not like a muffled thud of earth, but a brittle crunch. At first, I thought I had landed on another branch, perhaps a pile of old wood. My elbows and forearms stung from the scrapes, but when I pushed myself upright and looked down, a chill went through me. The surface beneath me was not wood at all. It was bone. For a moment, I convinced myself it might belong to some animal. The Chaco is home to deer, wild pigs, and troops of howler monkeys. Jaguars hunt them all, leaving behind scattered remains. But as I looked closer, I saw shapes that defied denial, long fingers, the curve of a ribcage. Then my gaze fell on the moss-covered dome of a skull, and every doubt fled. I had collapsed onto a human skeleton. A wave of dread surged through me so strong that my knees weakened. I crossed myself, whispered a shaky prayer, and forced myself to examine the scene. The bones were not fresh. They were stained by soil and time, partially swallowed by grass. This person had lain here for many years. I circled cautiously, flattening the grass as I went. That was when my boot struck something else. Another hard shape half buried in the dirt. I bent down, brushed away leaves, and froze. It was another skeleton, and not the last. Within minutes, I realized I was surrounded. Everywhere I turned, the empty sockets of skulls glared back at me. 2 bodies, 3, 5, a dozen. Human remains scattered across the forest floor, stretching farther than my eyes could follow. An open grave without coffins or markers. Some still wore fragments of clothing. Rotten shoes clung to bony feet. A rusted belt buckle glinted weakly in the sun. These were not ancient burials, not relics of forgotten tribes. These were modern men and women who had perished violently, discarded like refuse. My heart hammered. I remember thinking, if they died here, could I also die here? Whoever did this, what if they return? The weight of that thought drove me trembling back to my ATV. I wasted no time returning to our outpost in Puerto Libertad. My superior, Chief Inspector Dominguez, listened gravely as I recounted what I had seen. He did not accuse me of exaggeration or mistake. He only insisted we return at once so he could see it with his own eyes. When we arrived back at the site, his face drained of color. Together, we stood among the bones in silence, the air heavy with the presence of the dead. Before leaving, we knelt and said a prayer, though it felt pitifully small against the enormity of what we had uncovered. The case was swiftly handed over to the federal police, Argentina's equivalent of the FBI. Alongside our parks administration, they launched an investigation. What they pieced together was not entirely unexpected, but it was no less horrifying. From the 1970s into the 1980s, Argentina had lived under the shadow of the military dictatorship. During that dark era, thousands of citizens vanished. Teachers, activists, journalists, even students. Families called them the desaparecidos, the disappeared. What the police explained to us was part of a covert network of repression known as Operation Condor, a joint effort between several South American governments to eliminate anyone suspected of opposing their regimes. Among the most chilling methods of execution were the so-called death flights. Prisoners, often drugged, were loaded onto planes or helicopters. Then, once the aircraft reached remote regions, they were hurled alive into rivers, oceans, or wilderness. Thousands met their deaths this way, their families never knowing where their loved ones had fallen. The bones I had found were not random victims of nature. They were the discarded evidence of those atrocities. Men and women silenced by their own government, their final screams lost in the roar of engines and wind. Although investigators worked tirelessly, few of the bodies could be positively identified. Some families came forward, clinging to scraps of clothing or jewelry, desperate for closure. Others never knew. For me, it was impossible to walk through that stretch of forest again without feeling eyes upon me. The gaze of those countless souls, betrayed by their country and left to decay in silence. I tried to take comfort in knowing we had at least brought light to their resting place, that their existence would not be forgotten. Yet even now, decades later, I am haunted. At night, I sometimes dream of being on that plane, hands bound, my body lifted by strangers, the cold rush of air as the door opens, and then the endless fall. I have spent years surrounded by the beauty of the Chaco, the flight of macaws, the roar of jaguars, the whisper of the wind across the grasslands. But it is not those wonders that linger in my memory. It is that field of bones, the silence of the forgotten dead, and the reminder that sometimes the greatest monsters are not the jaguars or the fires, but other men. And that is the truth that will follow me until my last breath. My name isn't important, and even if it were, I wouldn't share it. Same goes for the company I used to work for. Let's just say it was a massive energy corporation with more money than it knew what to do with. The kind of company that bought politicians like kids buy candy. For years, I worked as a geological surveyor, crisscrossing the country with expensive equipment, hiking into remote landscapes, taking seismic readings, and writing reports that would eventually guide drilling projects. On paper, it sounds glamorous: travel, fresh air, good pay. And honestly, that was the reason I stuck with it as long as I did. You see, I love the outdoors. Always have. Mountains, deserts, forests, wetlands, you name it, I've been there. When you love being outside, and someone offers to pay you a comfortable salary to walk for miles with a fancy set of gadgets, it's hard to say no. Did I know the work I was doing would lead to drilling rigs, pipelines, maybe even spills? Of course. I'm not an idiot, but I told myself two things. One, the world can't run on solar panels and wind turbines overnight. And two, if I did my job carefully, there'd be fewer unnecessary test drills, which meant less wasted destruction. In my head, I was making things better, or at least less bad. That's what I told myself. And most days, I believed it. But there was one trip, my third assignment after officially qualifying, that changed everything. Changed how I saw my work. Changed how I slept at night. Changed my entire life. It was early autumn in New Mexico, out in the kind of barren land where red rock stretches into the horizon and silence presses down on you like a weight. I had to take an old dirt road about 10 miles from the nearest highway, park my truck under a lone cottonwood, and hike nearly 5 miles into a canyon where the geophones were set up. I remember thinking how beautiful it was out there. Endless sky, cliffs glowing orange in the late afternoon sun. The air so dry it burned your throat. It was lonely, sure, but a good kind of lonely. The kind that makes you feel small in the best way. I finished my readings and began the trek back. The hike was slow going. Heat clung to the rocks even as the sun dipped low, and my canteen was almost empty. I stopped a few times to sip water and wipe sweat from my forehead. That's when I noticed movement down the trail. At first, I thought it was a mirage heat shimmer tricking my eyes. But no, it was a man. A lone hiker coming my way. He looked maybe a little younger than me, late 20s, with sun-bleached hair that brushed his shoulders. He wore a faded t-shirt with some kind of peace symbol on it, cargo shorts, and beat-up hiking sandals. There was something distinctly drifter about him, like the type of guy who hitchhikes from festival to festival, living on trail mix and whatever cash he can scrape. When he saw me, he broke into a wide, toothy grin. "Didn't think I'd see anyone else out here," he said cheerfully. I'll admit I was glad for the company. Surveying is lonely work, and sometimes even a short chat can make your day feel brighter. We sat on a pair of flat rocks facing each other and exchanged the usual small talk. Where we'd been hiking, how hot the day was, whether we'd seen any rattlesnakes. For a while it felt good. Just two strangers in the wilderness, sharing a moment of human connection. But then, as conversations do, it wandered. He asked what I did for a living. I could have lied, should have lied. But for whatever reason, I told him the truth. I'm a surveyor for an energy company. The friendliness on his face faltered just slightly. Not anger, not disgust, just something harder behind his eyes. Energy company, huh? Yeah, I said quickly. Oil and gas technically, but my work is just data collection. I don't do the drilling myself. I just provide the info. He nodded slowly, listening, his smile curling back into place but never reaching his eyes. So you're the guy who tells them where to dig. I tried to defend it, explained how it was all regulated now, how the techniques were cleaner than decades ago, how efficiency meant less land torn up. I said the words I'd repeated to friends, to dates, even to myself in the mirror. I'm not destroying the land. I'm guiding careful use of it. He nodded along, never interrupting, letting me speak. When I was finished, he tilted his head and asked, still smiling, "So tell me, how do you sleep at night?" At first I thought I'd misheard. His tone was so casual, so calm, it didn't fit the question. But when I repeated it back, "How do I sleep at night?" he just nodded. I gave my usual answer, that I wasn't part of some evil weapons contractor, that I wasn't poisoning children in some distant country, that I was just a guy doing a job, and that if I did it responsibly, I was actually helping. He let me talk, then laughed softly. "You love the outdoors, but you're helping carve it up for profit. And you don't lose sleep over it? Man, that's rich." The conversation soured fast. I told him if he had a problem with me, fine, but I wasn't about to stand there and get insulted. I suggested we go our separate ways. He didn't move, just sat there, grinning like he knew something I didn't. Finally, I stood, brushed the dust off my pants, and started down the trail in the opposite direction of him. It added an hour to my hike, but I didn't care. I wanted as much distance between us as possible, or so I thought. About a mile later, I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, company man." I turned. There he was, stepping out from a stand of scrub, except this time he wasn't empty-handed. He held a revolver, pointed casually at the ground but unmistakably real. My stomach dropped. My hands shot up on instinct. He strolled onto the trail, that same easy smile plastered across his face. "Not so tough when it's just you and me, huh?" "Listen," I said carefully, my throat dry. "There's no need for this. You don't." "On your knees," he interrupted. The smile never wavered. I shook my head. No, I'm not doing that. In 2 strides, he closed the distance and jammed the barrel against my temple. Cold metal pressed into my skin. Do it, or you won't walk out of this canyon. I froze. I wasn't some action hero who could disarm a man with a gun. And deep down, I knew the truth. Whether I knelt or not, this guy might kill me. My choices were illusions. My body started to shake. He laughed at that. Scared, huh? That's good. You should be. Because what I'm doing right now, holding your life in my hands, is the same thing you do to the earth every day. He leaned close, voice dropping to a hiss. You choke the planet and you sleep just fine. But me? I'll sleep like a baby if I pull this trigger. I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream that he was insane, that he didn't know me, that he had no right. But no words came. My tongue felt like stone. My vision tunneled. The only thing I could think of was my mother, and how she'd never know what happened to me, how she'd spend years wondering. Then he pulled the trigger. Sharp sound effect. Gunshot ringing out. The world exploded. My left ear went dead, replaced by a shrill ringing. I crumpled, convinced I'd been shot, that my brain had been splattered across the canyon floor. My hands clawed at my head, but there was no hole, no blood. Only searing pain and the warmth of something wet trickling from my ear. Through the ringing, I heard his voice, faint but clear enough. Quit your job, parasite. Then footsteps retreating. By the time I dared to open my eyes, he was gone. Just the empty trail stretching before me, silent except for the ringing in my skull. Somehow, I staggered back to my truck. Somehow, I drove to the nearest ER, half-deaf and shaking so badly the wheel blurred in my hands. Doctors said the shot had ruptured my eardrum. Permanent partial hearing loss. The cops filed my report but never caught him. They didn't even have a name. I quit the company a few months later. Not because I suddenly saw myself as a villain, but because the weight of that encounter never left me. Every time I laced up my boots, I remembered the barrel against my temple, the smirk on his face, the deafening crack of the gun. And every night when I lie in bed, trying to fall asleep, I hear that same question echoing in the dark. How do you sleep at night?
When I finally earned my pilot's license, I thought I'd reached the top of the mountain. Not long after, I managed to secure what most would consider a dream gig, flying commercial jets for a big-name airline. The salary was solid, the uniform made me look sharper than I'd ever looked in my life, and passengers often treated me like some kind of minor celebrity. From the outside, it seemed like I was living a glamorous story. But inside, I hated every second of it. The rigid schedules, the constant polish, the false smiles, it felt suffocating. I was spending a fortune renting a place I barely set foot in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my life wasn't mine anymore. So one afternoon, after sitting in the cockpit staring at the endless runway, I made a decision that shocked everyone who knew me. I quit. Of course, I didn't leap without a parachute. Before handing in my 3 months' notice, I'd already lined up another job. The difference? This one required me to pack my life into a few bags and fly north, way north, into Alaska. The new gig was as a bush pilot, ferrying people and supplies into wild, often unreachable areas. My girlfriend at the time thought I'd lost my mind. We fought about it until the relationship collapsed, and by the time I sold off most of my things and boarded that one-way flight, we weren't speaking anymore. I ended up moving into a half-rotten cabin near a tiny airstrip tucked between forests and rivers. That first night, I almost regretted it. The place was so worn down I wondered if I'd condemned myself to a miserable life. But after a supply run into Fairbanks, a few groceries, and some minor repairs, the cabin started to feel like home. And truth be told, I loved the freedom. My workdays didn't feel like work. I flew interesting people, I got to decide my own pace, and there was something about waking up in the middle of unbroken wilderness that felt good for my soul. Not that it was all smooth skies. I had close calls with storms, brushes with wildlife that wanted me off their land, and sometimes I spotted things from the cockpit that I couldn't explain. What I'm about to tell you was one of those times. It was a clear spring morning, the kind of day pilots dream about: blue sky, no wind, visibility for miles. I had 2 researchers on board, heading out to a remote camp. After a couple hours in the air, I found myself scanning the endless forest below. Patches of open ground appeared here and there, irregular clearings where the trees gave way to meadows or rock. But one particular clearing caught my attention. At first glance, I thought I saw a neat row of saplings standing straight in the dirt. The symmetry was strange. Nature doesn't often arrange things in tidy lines. My instincts told me it had to be man-made. Curious, I dipped the plane lower, banking left for a closer look. That's when I realized they weren't trees. They were crosses. Not small markers, either. They were massive, towering things, planted deep into the ground. A chill passed through me, but it wasn't until I came around again that the full picture hit me. There were people strapped to those crosses. From a distance, they'd blended into the wood, but from overhead, I saw them, bodies sagging, some motionless, others writhing weakly as though trying to free themselves. The sight punched me in the gut so hard I nearly lost grip on the controls. I didn't dare make another pass. My brain screamed at me to stay on course, to pretend I'd never seen it, but my hands were already on the radio. Static filled the cockpit until finally I caught the signal from a logging camp miles away. When the man on the other end asked what I needed, I froze. How could I explain what I just witnessed without sounding insane? So I lied. I said I'd spotted some stranded campers who looked like they were in distress. I asked him to alert Wilderness Search and Rescue, to send someone out fast. He promised he would. I thanked him, shut the radio off, and focused on keeping the plane steady. The researchers behind me were chatting, oblivious to what I'd seen. For that, I was grateful. Their idle conversation kept me from spiraling too deep into my own thoughts. But once I dropped them off and headed home alone, the silence pressed in. I couldn't shake the images, the sagging figures, the jerking limbs, the towering crosses in the middle of nowhere. That evening, back in my cabin, I used the long-range radio to reach my boss. I told him, not everything, but enough. I said I thought I might have seen something out there in the wild. Something that didn't sit right. He listened quietly, then told me to take a week off. Fly back to Fairbanks, clear my head. So I did. We met at a steakhouse the night I landed. Between bites of baked potato, he told me human contact was the best cure for too much solitude. He wasn't wrong. It felt good to talk to another person face to face instead of through static. But then he said something I never forgot. He leaned back, wiped his mouth, and said, "People think Florida's the weirdest state. But Alaska beats them all. Strange doesn't just live here, it thrives here." He wasn't just talking about the wilderness swallowing hikers whole, or the number of people who'd vanished without a trace. He meant the ones who hadn't, the loners, the outcasts, the people who came here to escape the world. Some wanted peace. Some wanted isolation. And some, well, no one knew exactly what they wanted. I thought about that a lot in the months that followed. I saw other strange things in the skies, lights that danced where they shouldn't, shapes moving through the tree-line that looked too big to be animals. But nothing haunted me the way those crosses did. Even now, years later, I still hope it was all part of some kind of reenactment. A passion play, maybe. Volunteers willing to suffer briefly for their art. Because the alternative, that those people had been left there to die, is almost too much to stomach. And whenever I fly over those endless forests, I can't help glancing down, half expecting to see them again. In the summer of 2015, hard to believe that's well over a decade ago now, I was sitting in my apartment with a few buddies, knocking back beers while flipping through TV channels. At one point, I landed on the History Channel, and that's when we stumbled across a show I'd never heard of before. It was called Alone. For anyone unfamiliar, the concept is brutally simple. A handful of contestants are dropped into some unforgiving stretch of wilderness in Canada, far enough apart that they can't work together. Each person only gets a limited set of survival tools, and they're left to fend for themselves until they either tap out or endure longer than the others. The last person standing walks away with $1 million prize. The longer we watched, the more we got into it. What started as background noise quickly turned into heated debates among us. Who in our group would last the longest? Who would crumble first? Beers turned into arguments, and by the end of the night, we had reached only one unanimous conclusion: we needed to test ourselves. Not in some reality show production with safety nets and satellite phones, but in a real wilderness trip, just us, the wild, and nothing else. A way to prove, once and for all, who was the king of survival. Fast forward a few months, and there we were, 5 guys crammed into a truck, heading toward a place that sounded like it belonged in a horror novel, the River of No Return. Officially, it's known as the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. We started calling it the shorter, more menacing version because it made the trip sound more badass. With it being one of the largest stretches of untouched land in the United States, and practically in our backyard near Boise, it felt like the perfect testing ground. We drove through small towns and winding roads until we finally reached North Fork, a tiny community that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. From there, the trailhead would take us on foot toward a spot called Long Tom Mountain. Our plan was straightforward: 4 days of hiking there and back, with a full day of rest in between for fishing, swimming, and camping near the Salmon River. That first hike nearly broke me. By the time we set up camp on night 1, I collapsed into my sleeping bag and passed out like a corpse. The second day was easier, muscles warmed up, rhythm found, and when we reached the top of Long Tom Mountain, the view made it all worthwhile. Towering pines stretched for miles, the river shimmered like silver far below, and the air felt pure enough to bottle. We wasted no time. After setting up camp, we grabbed towels and gear and scrambled down toward the river. That day of swimming and fishing was the kind of memory that sticks with you forever. Dave, one of my closest friends, managed to pull in 2 fish with a small collapsible pole he'd insisted on bringing. They weren't monsters, but the thrill of cooking something we'd caught ourselves was incredible. We carried our prize back up the mountain, ready to start a fire. That's when things took a sharp, unsettling turn. Kyle, loud, hot-headed, and always quick with a sarcastic comment, went to his tent to grab something. Seconds later, he stormed back out, glaring at all of us. "All right, which one of you jokers took my backpack?" he demanded, his voice dripping with annoyance. We looked at him blankly. None of us had touched his stuff. "Don't screw around," he snapped. "Give it back before I get pissed." But the truth was, none of us had seen it. We laughed nervously, telling him that if we wanted to prank him, we'd have picked something funnier than hiding a bag. That's when it hit us: someone else had been in our camp. While we were splashing around in the river, another person had slipped in, gone through our gear, and stolen Kyle's entire backpack. The realization spread like wildfire. All of us froze, glancing at the tree line, the shadows, the places where eyes might be watching. It wasn't just about the stolen gear, it was the implication that we weren't alone. Kyle lost it. He stomped around, muttering curses, listing everything he'd lost: clothes, equipment, expensive hiking gear. Hundreds of dollars gone. All he had left was his pistol, his phone, and a handful of items that hadn't been inside the bag. Finally, he spat out, "Screw this. I'm going after him." That declaration immediately divided us. Kyle and Jay were ready to hunt the thief down, fists clenched and adrenaline high. The rest of us, me, Dave, and our quieter friend Shirid, argued against it. We weren't here to start some manhunt. We wanted an adventure, not a life-or-death encounter with some lunatic squatting in the woods. But Kyle wasn't hearing it. He and Jay stomped off, flashlights bobbing as they vanished into the trees. The three of us left behind sat around the fire in silence. Dave tried to ease the tension. Relax. They'll come back empty-handed and cool off. He was right. About 30 minutes later, Kyle returned, face tight with frustration but no longer boiling with rage. No thief, no bag. Just disappointment and a ruined mood. That night felt different. The wilderness had gone from beautiful to hostile in the blink of an eye. Instead of resting, we found ourselves whispering about what kind of person would steal from campers in the middle of nowhere. Were they dangerous? Were they watching us right then? The next day was supposed to be our relaxing downtime, swimming, fishing, enjoying the freedom of the wild. But the joy was gone. None of us wanted to leave camp unattended, not after what happened. Dave even suggested gathering extra firewood and keeping the fire burning all night. "Do you seriously think it's that bad?" I asked him. His answer chilled me. "I don't like how quiet it feels out here. Something's off. Better safe than sorry." That hit hard, because Dave wasn't a nervous guy. He'd grown up fishing and camping, way more experienced than the rest of us. If he was rattled, the situation was worse than we thought. We agreed on a night watch system, each of us taking turns to stay awake and keep the fire going. Armed with pistols and flashlights, we tried to laugh it off, but when you're sitting in the middle of the wilderness with only firelight pushing back the dark, your mind plays tricks. Every crack of a branch sounded like footsteps. Every rustle of leaves became something stalking us. Morning couldn't come fast enough. We decided to pack up early and start the return journey, still 2 days from the trailhead. Spirits lifted slightly as the sun rose higher. Maybe the thief had taken what he wanted and vanished. Maybe we'd never see him again. But fate had other plans. Late that afternoon, Shirid excused himself to use the bathroom. Like all of us by then, he carried his gun, just in case. A few minutes later, his scream tore through the forest. We bolted toward the sound, hearts pounding, only to meet him halfway back, face pale and eyes wide with terror. "I saw him," he gasped. "I swear to God, I saw him." He described walking far enough for privacy, double-checking the trees before crouching down. That's when he noticed someone watching him. A figure in the distance, maybe 100 yards away. What stood out wasn't his clothes or shape, it was his face. Painted stark white, like a mask or smeared makeup. Shirid hadn't waited to get a closer look. The second he locked eyes with that ghostly figure, he bolted. The image haunted all of us. A man, deep in the wilderness, deliberately painting his face white and stalking campers. Suddenly, Kyle wasn't itching for confrontation anymore. Even he went quiet, processing the horror of it. That night, we abandoned the idea of camping again. Instead, we packed everything up and started hiking in the dark. Better to risk exhaustion than sit like sitting ducks while some painted-face creep circled us. The forest at night is a different world. Every shadow hides monsters. Every sound is amplified. Our flashlights cut weak beams through the dark, and each of us kept glancing over shoulders, half expecting that white painted face to appear between the trees. Then Jay froze. His flashlight caught something hanging from a branch. It was Kyle's missing backpack. The straps dangled like it had been carefully displayed, and the fabric was shredded, punctured by multiple arrows. Someone hadn't just stolen it, they'd turned it into a twisted message. We clustered around it, speechless. The silence was heavy, broken only when Shirid whispered, "This isn't real. This can't be happening." Kyle yanked his pack down despite Jay warning about preserving evidence. But it didn't matter, who would we even show it to? The cops weren't going to launch some SWAT team into the mountains over a vandalized backpack. Kyle did eventually turn one of the arrows into the authorities, but they explained the markings were just manufacturing codes, common sporting goods anyone could buy at Walmart. A dead end. We never saw the man again on the hike back. But that didn't comfort us. If anything, the silence made it worse. Whoever he was, he'd proven himself smarter, more patient, and far more dangerous than we were. If Kyle had gotten his wish for a showdown, we all knew deep down it would have ended badly for us. The drive home wasn't quiet like I expected. Instead, we argued endlessly about what had happened. Was he just some drifter playing sick mind games? Was he preparing to hurt us but changed his mind? Or was it all some elaborate scare tactic we'd never understand? The only thing we agreed on was this: we'd never go near the river of no return again. It's hard to believe, but almost 15 years have passed since I took one of the most unforgettable trips of my life. This was before my husband and I settled down, before children, before responsibilities pulled me in every direction. Back then, I still carried with me the old childhood dream of being a horse girl. I had grown up obsessed with everything to do with riding, so when I found out there were ranches in Montana offering guests the chance to take part in a real horse drive, I knew I had to do it. In the spring of 2009, I finally booked my spot. The program was being run by a working ranch tucked away in southern Montana. I flew into Billings, where I was picked up alongside several other guest riders who had flown in from different corners of the world. I remember being surprised that some had traveled all the way from Europe just to join the adventure. The drive out to the ranch was long, just over 2 hours, and that stretch of highway gave us the chance to swap stories, share our excitement, and try to imagine what the next 5 days would bring. When we finally reached the ranch, we were welcomed by the cook with a hearty dinner. Sitting around those wooden tables with strangers who would soon become my riding companions felt almost surreal. Our guide gave us the rundown of what we'd be doing. The first day or two would be warm-up rides, both to get us used to our horses and to help us work as a group. We'd also have time to talk with some of the wranglers about their lifestyle and the skills we'd need. And then, the real challenge: driving a herd of around 150 horses from the ranch in Montana across the border into Wyoming, where they'd spend the summer. It was billed as the full cowboy experience. To me, it sounded like a slice of heaven. But little did I know, heaven had a shadow, and by the end of the week, I'd be reminded just how harsh and unpredictable the wilderness could be. The morning after we arrived, we were woken early, fed a big breakfast, and led down to the stables to meet our mounts. My horse for the week was a beautiful caramel-colored Mustang with a black mane streaked with pale spots, like flecks of vanilla. The ranch hands told me her name was Chip, because the combination of her colors reminded them of a chocolate chip cookie. From the moment I climbed into the saddle, I felt connected to her. She was steady and obedient, but still had a playful spark of energy. She became my partner for the journey. Since nearly everyone in our group had riding experience, it didn't take long before we were heading deep into the Montana wilderness. The trail unfolded through sweeping valleys and ridges, the kind of landscape that makes you feel as though you've slipped back in time. Riding out into that raw, open country, I felt something I can only describe as pure exhilaration. It was as if the weight of modern life fell away, and I was tasting the kind of freedom that had lured people westward more than a century ago. By evening, we returned to the ranch, exhausted but buzzing with excitement. After supper, we collapsed into our bunks, knowing the next morning would bring even more. And sure enough, it did. The following day, we saddled up and headed north into the plains, our task being to locate one of the wild herds that roamed near the ranch. At first, there was nothing but miles of flat, open land, no horses in sight. But after an hour of steady riding, we crested a low rise, and there they were. The sight took my breath away. Spread across the horizon were over 150 Mustangs, coats of bay, chestnut, palomino, and red glinting under the sun. These weren't just horses. They were descendants of the Spanish stock that had escaped centuries earlier, their bloodline stretching all the way back to the 1600s. They weren't simply animals, they were a living piece of history. And it was our job to push them back toward the ranch. That first attempt, though, nearly broke me. The wranglers didn't sugarcoat anything. They barked orders at us the same way they did at each other, and most of those orders came wrapped in curses. They rode with an intensity that was almost frightening, cutting off the herd with a kind of aggression I wasn't used to. For someone raised in the city, their way of working felt raw and harsh, but I had to adapt quickly or risk being left behind. By midday, we finally had the herd moving. When the ranch buildings came into view, we stopped for a quick meal, then pressed on again until sundown. That evening, we ate dinner back at the ranch, where the wranglers warned us, "Get some sleep, because from here on out, the days would start before dawn, and the nights wouldn't be spent in bunks anymore. We'd be sleeping out on the open plains, under the stars." I barely managed to close my eyes that night, I was too wired with anticipation. So when the 4:30 wake-up call came, I was groggy. Still, after a strong cup of bitter cowboy coffee and a stack of pancakes, I felt ready to climb back into the saddle. The herd was restless that morning, and it took all of us working together to keep them in a semicircle moving south. Every so often, a young colt would break free, forcing one of us to chase it down and steer it back. I'll never forget the rush of galloping across the plain, leaning forward as Chip thundered beneath me, cutting off a runaway and pushing it back into line. That moment was pure magic. By nightfall, we reached our first outdoor camp. We strung a high line between trees to tie the horses, then set up our tents in a rough circle around the fire pit. Dinner was simple, beans, jerky, and coffee, but sitting around the fire, talking over the day's ride, it tasted better than any meal I could remember. When most people drifted off to their tents, I stayed awake, lying back to watch the stars. The night sky out there was unbelievable, an ocean of glittering light stretching forever. The air was so still I could hear the horses snorting softly in the dark. One of the wranglers, who couldn't sleep either, sat with me, and we talked about nothing important, just the flavor of different beef jerky brands, when suddenly something flew through the air and landed close to the fire. I'll never forget the sound it made when it hit the dirt. I screamed before I even saw what it was, waking half the camp. Everyone crowded around, and the firelight revealed something that chilled me to the bone, the back half of a rabbit, torn clean through. Just legs and a bloody tail lying in the dust. One wrangler muttered that a bird might have dropped it mid-flight, but I wasn't convinced. The way it came in, it didn't fall straight down. It had an arc to it, like it had been hurled. The wranglers saddled up, fanning out into the darkness to check the area. They came back empty-handed and told us it was probably some prankster from a nearby town trying to spook us. Maybe that was true, maybe not. Either way, we packed up camp earlier than planned the next morning, driving the herd 20 miles farther south. The ride that day carried a much heavier mood. No one laughed or told stories. Even the wranglers seemed tense. But our work kept us busy, and by the time we crossed a river that afternoon, we'd started to relax, at least a little. That night, though, things took a turn I'll never forget. We had just settled into our tents when the horses suddenly erupted into noise, snorting, stamping, tugging against the line. The watchman shouted into the dark, "Who's there?" And then came the sound of hooves. Before we could even process it, our tethered horses broke free and came barreling straight toward camp. The chaos that followed was beyond anything I'd ever imagined. 18 terrified horses stormed through the tents. People were trampled before they could even get clear. One wrangler was knocked flat and nearly crushed. Guests were flung aside, some smashed into each other and then stomped under hooves that didn't even slow down. The ropes and metal buckles from the tack lashed out like weapons, leaving bloody cuts. It was a nightmare of noise, dust, and screams. When the last horse disappeared into the night, the camp looked like a battlefield. Broken tents, scattered gear, groaning riders clutching injuries. I'd been lucky, my tent flattened, my belongings ruined, but my body somehow untouched. Others weren't so fortunate. One rider, a German man named Jürgen, had been crushed badly, broken ribs, teeth knocked out, his chest barely rising. Others had sprains, broken wrists, dislocated shoulders, cuts across their faces. But Jürgen was the worst, and by dawn, it was clear he needed to be airlifted out. The rest of us were shuttled back to the ranch in trucks, the injured taken straight to the hospital. We were shaken, exhausted, and stunned by what had happened. The ranch owners tried to make it right. They offered everyone either a full refund or a chance to return one day for another drive, completely free. I chose the second option. I wanted to come back, not to erase what happened, but to reclaim the dream. Years later, I still haven't returned. Life got busy, as it does. But if I ever do ride again in Montana, I won't arrive with naive ideas about cowboy adventures. That land is beautiful, yes, but it's also wild and dangerous. People live hard lives there, and not everyone welcomes outsiders. And sometimes, out in the darkness of those endless plains, you can feel that the land itself doesn't, either. Thanks for riding along with me on these stories, friends. If you enjoyed it, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a tale from Dark Deck Chronicles. I'd also love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And as always, your likes, shares, and comments keep this channel alive. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep the stories alive.